Matthew McLean is a full-time faculty member and arts department head here at Choate, where he directs the school's wind ensemble, jazz combo, and teaches a number of music electives, including music production and jazz history. With 25 years of full-time teaching experience, he has led jazz ensembles and wind ensembles in public and private institutions. During Matthew's decade-long tenure at Little Red Schoolhouse and Elizabeth Irwin High School in New York City, he dedicated himself toward developing progressive pedagogies that engage all learners in the creation of original music. Through this experience, Matthew founded and directed the nonprofit organization Young Composers and Improvisers Workshop that serves to bring music composition to NYC public schools. While an adjunct faculty member at New York University, he began a continuing association with NYU's Music Experience Design Lab. MuseEd Lab researches and designs new technologies and experiences for music making, learning, and engagement. Matthew has presented on various music education topics and been a guest clinician at several national music education conferences. Matthew remains an active performer, playing tenor saxophone in a variety of jazz settings. And while I'm sorry to say we didn't have enough time for a pre-podcast jam, I'm confident Matthew's words will be music to your ears. Matthew was co-interviewed by science teacher and fellow academic technologist Dr. Viva Zhao, and we dove into the nuances of Matthew's progressive pedagogy that's informed by wise application of educational technology. Though Matthew is obviously coming from the context of a music classroom, the insights he shares cut to the core of what it means to be a good teacher, and we hope everyone listening can adapt some of these principles into their respective disciplines. So we touched on Matthew's career journey, his vision for the Choate Arts Department, what to do when things don't go as planned in the classroom, the importance of reflection in the learning process, being aware of when technology is helping or hindering creativity, empowering students and facilitating collaboration, using Pear Deck in the classroom to keep lectures social and interactive, designing learning experiences that fuel lifelong curiosity, knowing our students and our students knowing us as whole people, the importance of play and the flow state in the learning process, approaches to technology and parenting, and Matthew sends us off with the absolute funkiest TECcast music recommendation yet. So without further ado, Matthew McLean.
Hello.
Welcome to the studio.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. Congratulations on recently stepping into the arts department chair role.
Thank you very much.
We're excited to have you in that position, especially from a tech front, having worked with you for a few years, knowing you're consistently on the cutting edge of this stuff. It's great to have someone at the helm who's
trying
team player. Yeah. Now, we'd love to hear a little bit about your journey up to this point. So you're currently the arts department chair. Take us through your career journey up through now, and if there are any points in that career journey where it's particularly relevant to mention anything about how technology played in there.
For sure. All right, so I'll give you the sort of brief synopsis, but there is a point where technology sort of leapt out and kind of altered my path a little bit. But yeah, so studied music in undergraduate, composition, music performance, went to New York City to play music and was writing music and performing music, and I knew I was going to be teaching. So not long after moving to New York, I attended Columbia University Teachers College to get my master's in education, and so I started teaching sort of all the way back then, beginning in like K through 3 at school in the Bronx, the public school, New York City public school, doing general music and all kinds of everything you're asked to do as a new music teacher. So I started teaching, in the 90s, stayed in the public schools in New York for a while. I ended up at a big public high school in Staten Island, Port Richmond High School, doing mostly instrumental. So all the bands, jazz ensemble, those kinds of things. And I knew that I wanted to make the shift to like the independent school world. So I always kept my eye open to some job positions, and I found a great school in Manhattan that I knew about prior to there being an opening, Little Red Schoolhouse and Elizabeth Irwin High School, a great school, really progressive. But the music, they didn't really have much of an instrumental program, so I was going to have to teach general music, which for music teachers, it's not the most desirable kind of position. But I took it. It was 5th grade through 12th grade.
Is that not the most desirable because...
It's because it's, often these are classes in which every student has to take, particularly with middle school kids, it's looked at as like an activity. It's sort of like the teacher gets a break and then they go to music and you teach them all manners of music.
Right.
So we did vocal music and, all different kinds of projects. But anyway, when I was at Columbia Teachers College, that program was very progressive, and it was all about experiential learning and how to learn an art, particularly in this case, music, through being creative. So even though you're teaching like a performing art in which there is a sort of old school technique for teaching it, Columbia University had this really progressive program in which very student-centered, all the outcomes were based on some kind of creative endeavor. And it really it came at a time when I was trying to be creative as a musician myself. So I really saw that as a connection to what I wanted to do with music. I could learn about how we learn music, how I could potentially teach music at the same time while I'm trying to be creative with music. So then fast forward many years later, so 10 or 12 years later, I get to this progressive independent school and I'm asked to teach regular music, general music. So it was at that point where I really went back to my graduate studies and decided to create a curriculum that was totally based on creativity. Nice. So everything we did with the kids was like, you're going to make this kind of song, or you're going to make this kind of composition. You're going to do sort of some collaborative thing with another discipline. And all was like, and it fit in with the philosophy of the school. And I was very much supported in doing that. So after a couple of years of kind of tweaking things and messing around, I came with this idea that all my kids, everything we were going to do was going to be framed within the context of music composition, particularly with the middle school kids. So 5th through 8th grade, all of my music classes, they composed, and that's not a great word. It has a lot of problems because people think it's like a serious thing that not everybody can do. But I just mean all the kids created music throughout the entire year, but we wanted to make it so Little Red Schoolhouse is all about like having the curriculum based in the real world. So we wanted the kids to like experience what it really means to be a quote unquote composer.
Cool.
So to heighten the experience without it becoming too challenging for the kids, I found a way, and this is where the technology came in, to have kids create music, compose music, and then have it realized, interpreted by professional musicians. So they would write all manner of like chamber music, started with solo pieces, trios, duets, and then eventually like a chamber piece. Twice a year, we would hire a professional ensemble, and they would come in and play every single kid's piece. So it was a big deal. Like no matter what you made, it was going to be realized by professional musicians. We invited families. It was like a concert. And the sort of fits and starts for this program to happen didn't involve a lot of technology until, coincidentally, there was a music notation editor that came out for the browser, still around. It's called NoteFlight.
Oh, yeah.
And I was a very early adopter. I reached out to the developer and like got them involved in our program. They came and visited the school, and they wanted to know how we were using it at the school and all this stuff. And it really allowed kids to just go on a computer and not have to know. And I say this really literally, like they did not have to know anything about music. They would just like mess around with music notation by doing stuff on the computer. And through that sort of messing around, they learned concepts and skills. They could obviously hear what they were doing. But at the end of the whole thing, they would have like a printed sheet of music. They could hear it in the computer for sure, but the idea was you're going to have to give this to another musician and they're going to play it. So that was kind of like the project coming full circle. So it was through that program, we called it Young Composers and Improvisers Workshop. I ended up founding a nonprofit organization so that we could offer it to public schools. So we started offering the program to public schools throughout New York. And I would spend my spring, I would train teachers in the fall. They would do it with their kids. We had a whole component of composer mentors because it was all online. The notation software was on the browser. So I could have composers who I would contract to look at the kids' music and give them feedback in the same way that I would give my students feedback, like in the class. And the thing I do want to mention, we talk about the computer being used and this notation software. It was very much a collaborative class. So I would still have, 12 to 15 kids in music class. And yes, there would be these Chromebooks with this software on it, but I was sharing what they were doing on the screen. We were talking about each other's pieces together as a class. It was very much collaborative. Kids would work together occasionally. So it wasn't, I feel every time we talk about like a laptop or a computer, it's particularly in like a general music class, because I did get some pushback. I had parents, it was a very progressive school, but had a long history with like folk singing. So the music teachers before me were like folk singers, and everybody, came in and they sang songs, and that's great, and that's super important. So I did get some pushback as far as like, well, how is this progressive? I want my kid to be like actually making music. And there was, so I did have to really make sure that was honored, and kids were feeling like it was hands-on and not just like sitting at a computer moving a mouse around. So I would use classroom music instruments, Orff instruments, percussion instruments, and we would perform the concepts that they were then going to have to put into their piece on the computer. We would use our voice for that, of course. But it was really easy to talk about, okay, we're talking about, orchestration and what does that mean? And we talk about, like, you can have a background part with a melody. We would do that first, like in the classroom with instruments, messing around. Even if it sounded horrible, it didn't really matter. They were just getting the concept down. Then when they get to the computer, they have this idea of like, oh, I know what orchestration means, and I can try this technique for homophonic texture, and I'll do it with these instruments, these string instruments that I know are going to play my piece.
Cool.
So anyway, that's how the curriculum started. We refined it, like I said, made a nonprofit, and then we started having public schools take part. It became a little community, and it was, for what we had set out as our goals, it was successful, and it was great. It was a little bit too much work for me to try to have a full-time teaching job and do this.
Yeah.
So we started getting schools from different parts of the country because it was, like I said, there were these online components. So I would share the curriculum. They would register online with my curriculum and then use NoteFlight. So at one point I was like partnered with NoteFlight, and they would offer the subscription to NoteFlight for a discount and all this and that. So it was happening around, and I did have ideas like, oh, maybe this is what I'm going to be doing with my life. Like, I'm not going to be a teacher. But it was, it was great and rewarding, but I still just wanted to be a teacher. So when I left New York, came up here, I winded it down. I kind of passed it on to someone else. And then it was kind of going for a little while, but I know at this point it's sort of been parked. It's like, it's a thing that exists, but it's not really active. But I look back on it as like a great teaching tool for myself to see like how I could integrate different technologies, because it then included, beyond NoteFlight, we started looking at certain iPad applications and other web applications that do the same thing, allow kids to like manipulate music basically, know, and do it in a way such that the goal was to have them compose a piece of music. So it really got me into all these other things, certainly. And funnily enough, we used a version of Canvas because Canvas was, I don't know if it's still like this, but you could get your own install of Canvas for free.
Oh, wow.
And GitHub, you could like get it. And so we managed our own and like edited, totally changed it to make a course that kids could go through if they weren't at our school. So all these other weird technologies that I would have never used, I kind of got in touch with through doing this kind of composition project basically with my students.
Yeah.
So, I was doing instrumental music at the same time. So I always had a jazz ensemble, wind ensemble, because this was a K through 12 school. So I was doing that at the high school. And when I came to Choate, I would tell Kalia Yanatos, those of us who might remember Kalia, that coming here, I got to like teach all of my passions because I'm really obviously passionate about performing and jazz, and I get to do that here. I've always had a recording studio in my house, my apartment when I was in New York, so I've always been like recording, so I get to teach music production here. And then doing the honors music theory, that's the sort of creative compositional side that I get to work with students on. So here at Choate is where I get to like do all of the things that my musical journey has included so far, I would say. So I feel lucky. Yeah. Including the tech. The tech is a big part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear that. I feel similarly about how the basket of things that I end up getting to do here just worked out. If you would have asked me what, things would you
pick all the things you want to do.
Like, these things.
It's kind of nice.
And, these boarding school communities, they lend themselves well to people like you who are multi-talented and multifaceted and exist. I remember, I forget who it was one time, but I remember hearing someone remark that though you may not be the best at any one given thing, you are the best at the intersection of all the things that you're interested in.
Yeah, certainly being at any school, but definitely at boarding school. You got to wear multiple hats, and do all these things. Yeah, it's great. I like it.
How have those things that you're involved in on the ground started to inform whatever kind of vision you might have in your head already for like the future of the arts department?
Whoa, wow.
Small question.
That's a big one. I would say I'm still thinking about the future of my classes and my ensembles. And I think, as we have a great department and there's lots of people with a lot of great ideas. So I'm definitely not coming in with like, this is how you should do things. I certainly want to share what I do and help others who are interested in doing things like that. But I think there's a lot of brain power that I'm looking forward to learning what other folks are doing. But I am still thinking about my classes and the ensembles, and that's what's great. It's like, when I came here, I had ideas, particularly how technology could fit into the ensembles, definitely the music theory course, music production, it's built into it. But those have been changing, and so I have new things that I want to try next year, and kind of go from there.
Cool. Yeah, so take us into a little bit of the details of with your classes? I know you've been experimenting with one app called StaffPad and others as well. I'm curious, anything you want to report out from experimentations with our wonderful iPad ecosystem and applying that to your classes?
Yeah, so I definitely was, I think I might have asked Katie at my first interview, or I forget what, maybe it was one of the job search conferences, if Choate was an iPad school. Because that's important to me. Like, I've been teaching in an iPad school I was teaching in a school for 10 years before that. So a lot of the things I do, I want to use the iPad. So that they're here is great. And so I was excited to kind of carry that out, because it gets back to the idea of creativity in all art, but definitely music. And my philosophy is a progressive one, in such that, like, if I want someone to learn something, if a student or if I have a class that I'm creating the curriculum, my feeling is that they're going to learn it best if they're using it creatively, if they're making something with it. And there are many ways in which to do that, and technology can take many forms, but certainly the iPad gives an immediacy to what kids are doing that really makes that creative part come to life. So if we're talking about the honors music theory, I previously mentioned this application, NoteFlight. It's a music notation software that lived in the browser. But I knew that music theory there's a certain component in which there's a handwritten element, that kids are writing music. They're using the staff and they're writing music. And the idea that the iPad has the pencil, I was from the very beginning looking at millions of apps that have come along with, like, this is notation software. You can write with the pencil.
I swear, every single app that I ask if you've heard of, you're like, yep, try that.
I literally would go on the app store and just type in my search music notation or whatever, music apps, and just browse every couple of weeks, whatever,
Which was manageable for the first couple of years, and now it's
crazy,
tsunami,
But there were always developers trying to make notation apps, and they never really measured up. They were never really a great experience in terms of, like, recognizing the handwritten part of the pencil, or, like, the sounds were terrible, whatever it was. Or anyway, along comes this app, StaffPad. It's probably been around, I don't know, 5 or 6 years maybe at this point. I'm not quite sure. But it is super intuitive in terms of any student's handwritten notation, instantly being able to transform it into computerized notation, which for a course like honors music theory, in which typically they'd be using pencil and paper to write exercises, which is the way in which historically we learn sort of 4-part voice writing to learn music theory and chord progressions and melody and all that stuff. When you do it on paper, it's great, but you can't hear what you've written. So now with this application, StaffPad, students can write, and instantly it turns it into a computerized score, which they can hit play on and hear, right? Let alone, all the editing that comes along with that, which is really helpful. So there's an immediacy that is sort of transformed, I would say, sort of boring type of assignments to more creative ones. So that's kind of the first part about it. So not only can a kid hear their own music, but it makes the classroom much more collaborative, so we can share what we're doing just by listening to it. Because that's a big part of any sort of music class, particularly a music theory class, if we want to develop our ears. There's like an ear training, and be able to hear what it says on the page. So if I can have a kid bring in their assignment, I can obviously hear it, but they can play it for each other before looking at it, which is kind of like a big thing. Does this sound like it works? And why not? And what are you hearing? So to get into the weeds, there's like forbidden intervals and things. So I might put on the projector a kid's homework and StaffPad, but just the audio part, and play it and ask the class with using the ears, like, could you hear the mistakes? Or could you hear, I might start more positively. Could you hear what sounds great? Like, why does that work? And we could talk about that. And then I'll show the visual part of it, and we can actually see, what it is. And then in real time, we can edit the notes and then instantly hear the differences that we want to hear. So that's been pretty revolutionary for how we do music theory. It's something that I've always wanted to do in an ensemble, is to have a more immediate creative part of that too, because that's another thing. If I'm, I consider myself like a progressive educator, and I mentioned a moment ago about using creativity at every step. When you get to a performing arts class or a performing ensemble class, like wind ensemble or jazz ensemble, particularly wind ensemble, there's not a ton of creativity usually allowed for students to have. They're interpreting somebody else's music, and that's just the way it is. So another thing that StaffPad allows is a free compendium app in which any user can open that app, and whatever I'm doing in StaffPad or any other user, it'll instantly show up on their iPads. So that's been great for, like, I might demonstrate a little something on my staff pad that I want them to play, and then they can all instantly see on their iPad in the right key of their instrument and all that stuff and play it, and I can change it, etc. But the goal really, and this is a kind of work in progress, Morgan, as you know, we had some some starts with this project, and there were some technical things that we're still trying to figure out. But my sort of dream that is yet to be realized is to have some original music that we write as a class that we then perform at a concert.
Oh, yeah.
And
cool.
staff pad, because every student can have it, we can work collaboratively on a piece. We can then play it because, like I said a second ago, it can show up on everybody's iPad. So, you know, Morgan in the trumpet section can change a couple of flute notes and the flutes will see it, and then we can actually play it and we can talk about like, does that sound good? Do we like that? And then go from there. So that's where we're headed with that. So my hope is that soon we will start to have like more original pieces that we made as a group, you know? So that's kind of this idea of using staff pad in an ensemble to be creative.
That's so great. And I'm confident that next year that vision will find.
We're working on it. We're working on it. Has a lot to do. One of the things you realize when you have, you know, I think one of the things we wanted to talk about today was like your classroom setup.
Yeah.
And in like a regular 9 to 12 kid setup, it's not a big deal to say like, oh, you know, I use the Apple TV, projector, and the iPads. But with Wind Ensemble, you know, I have a class of almost 50 kids. So one of the pitfalls we saw was like, you know, there's a problem with sort of the whatever mechanism connects all those iPads to the server.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it wasn't working in that way.
Right.
You know, so there's like a larger. We need to get more people involved to figure out some of those problems.
Yeah.
But we'll get there. We'll figure it out.
Bring Steve Glassman and the whole network crew for a whole week.
Totally.
Figure it out. What you mentioned about the being able to do multiple iterations of things quickly that would have taken a lot longer before. There's a similar thing going on with computer science right now. I remember seeing a few years ago when Apple released this Swift Playgrounds thing. I was like, oh my God, maybe I would have majored in computer science if this was around back then. I took Java and that I was repelled by computer science because of this, because it was just like you had to go through, write out all this code, spend hours on it, and then try to go, you know, compile it or whatever, and then it's like, oh, no, error, figure, and then you just have to go manually comb through and find it, and then finally, if it then is all compiled perfectly, then you can see what it actually is doing. But with this Swift Playgrounds and I'm sure Khan Academy and other code learning things now, you can see each little chunk of code that you're putting in. You can see in real time. You have a split screen of like the 3D character that you're building right next to it, and everything. The real time feedback seems to be so powerful.
Yep, and it's not just the staff pad with notation editor. Obviously, people know about things like GarageBand and things that are on the iPad, and there's a million other applications. It's, you know, I don't think if you're of a certain generation, you realize how quickly younger people, students, you know, that are coming to Choate have already been messing around with those elements and been creative with them already. So that's another thing too, is like I kind of feel like if I weren't this way in terms of wanting kids to be creative, they would have been pushing me that way because they're already doing it.
Yeah, right.
You know, they're already, like you just said a second ago, they don't need to like go through a bunch of code to figure out how to make a program. They're doing it and seeing the feedback right away.
Yeah.
You know, it's pretty cool.
You said something a second ago about the glitches that we're experiencing with staff pad. I know that's just one area of experimentation where you've probably experienced some glitches. Now, the people listening here are teachers in all different subjects who have all experienced their own version of tech that you planned for some great classroom activity just not working.
Yeah.
So when you're faced with that kind of situation where the technology is not cooperating with what you had originally planned, how do you pivot in the middle of that situation? And I'm sure there's different.
Sure,
depends
that's a good
on the context.
question.
But.
Yeah, you know, I think the first thing that I always think of and that I do is to share the process with the kids. So, you know, they may see me get flustered at first if something's not working, but you know, I think it's important to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit and share with them, like, you know, like this is what I had planned. This is why I thought it was a useful way to spend our time. And there's a couple things that are making this impossible right now, and you know, we're just gonna deal with it. So that's the first thing, to kind of like just, you know, lower everybody's expectation maybe is one good outcome of that. And then the second thing, I've definitely been in those moments where like, oh man, I don't have a plan. And I think after that happens once or twice, then you realize like, okay, I need to have some other backup plan. So I feel like I have enough just built up over the years, enough like paper and pencil things that will kind of meet a similar objective we can fall back on. There's never anything, and again, that just comes from having done it a lot. But yeah, I could, I think that the exception is maybe if I'm trying something brand new and I haven't given a lot of thought about how we would do it multiple ways, then I might run into a problem where, you know what, guys, we're gonna try something, a different topic. We're gonna like totally shift and maybe do a couple lessons down the road that we weren't gonna get to or something like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think having a paper and pencil, quote unquote, way to do something always in the back of what I am trying to do is helpful. But I've had those few moments, and that's, you're flying without a net in those times, and you remember that, So I try to not put myself in that position again. Yeah. But yeah, like I started with it, if you share with the kids, they will be graceful about it. They'll give you, permission to fail. I think that's a huge part of my teaching. That I want them to see me as a learner.
Right.
And so they can see me fail at this, and that's okay, and that's what I want them to do, So try to keep it real.
Right.
In that way.
It really does have that kind of effect. I've seen only a positive effect when you are vulnerable in that sense.
Yeah. And kids know. They know when you're trying something. They appreciate it. And as long as you're excited about it, they're going to be giving you slack, the first couple times. Maybe if it goes on too long.
Then they'll make fun of you.
Exactly. Totally.
I want to make a quick transition here and talk about something that's similar. We touched on, or I hear you talk a lot about the intersection of technology, education, innovation, and gleaning a lot of helpful insights. So thank you for that. I want to transition to talk about something that's similar. In our discussion of technology, education, innovation, we have to also discuss reflection and contemplation. And one of my very favorite educational philosophers, John Dewey, once stated that we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflecting on experience, right? Which basically suggests that learning does not occur simply through the act of experiencing something, but rather through the process of actively reflecting upon that experience. So I think this is particularly true and important in the musical arts, where students are doing something super hands-on, something very minds-on, right? Hands-on and minds-on. And arts has been historically regarded as a means of self-reflection, self-expression. And so I'm very curious as to hear about how you've used tech in a way that supports students in reflecting, connecting with their personal experiences, embracing their talents, and discovering their potentials.
Yeah. Great quote. I share the love of John Dewey and all things that he says about education for sure. I have two main things about how technology helps and can hinder in terms of how we use it to reflect. So the obvious one that I think a lot of music teachers would share, and I'll start with that, is, in an instrumental setting, could be a lesson, an ensemble, just the mere fact that it's really easy to record oneself now helps students get that feedback. One of my sayings is I want there to be a feedback loop that the kids have themselves. I interject myself into that loop to get it started, but then I want the loop to involve them by themselves, and certainly something like an iPad or any, a phone that they can record themselves and listen back to. They're going to get that objective feedback that helps them reflect and then make changes, etc. So we use that a ton in that setting. With things like music creation software, whether it be applications, the iPad, Logic Pro, GarageBand, things like that, it can be a double-edged sword because like we were talking earlier, like the creativity there's an immediacy to it. And that's great if a kid is excited and has ideas and wants to share them with other people. It's not great, and I've seen it be problematic when that feedback is sending a lot of negative signals right away, too early in the process. As an example, they're creating a melody and they, start jotting it down on this digital sort of means, and they're hearing it back. I've had students who hear it back and say, that's horrible. And then they're stopped in their tracks and they're stuck. And they haven't gone through those maybe 5 iterations of trying something till they get something that they like. So a lot of teaching, for me, teaching with technology is basically teaching creativity. So if you're presented with these tools, you have to use them in a way that are going to help you be creative. So if like my example of the student who's creating a melody and they're hearing it back and they're saying it's horrible, I have to stop and work with that student about like, okay, and you have to reserve judgment until the proper time. So maybe I'm going to create a great melody on my 7th try or something. So I find, and this can happen at different points in a project, and I think every learner is this, every creative person is this way, certain part of, let's say, creating a song in Logic Pro, which I might do for music production. They're really good at making the beat at the beginning and they're psyched about it, but then they don't know how to morph that into something that can have melody and chords and bass lines and things like that. So that student might need to have the creative loop sort of maybe, or the feedback loop turned off at a certain point. Like just put down a bunch of ideas, get together with a friend, get some feedback, or I will give you feedback as your teacher. Whatever it is to kind of keep the creative ball rolling. That's what it is. It's so immediate and the feedback is so, and I think we see this in kids in other areas. Like if you look at social media and the ways they're developing impressions of themselves because of that feedback that's coming. It can be the same using a creative tool, Yeah. So to put a point on it, that idea of like, it's not just the experience. I don't want a kid to just mess around. Okay. And this is an example that we see a lot where a music teacher comes into a classroom. There's all kinds of technology. Kids are messing around with it and they think like, oh yeah, learning is happening and they're being creative. But like you just said, that quote, like, no, it's really that important step of reflecting on it, codifying maybe in their own way what they're doing, being able to explain it and then use it, that has to happen. So I'm always, leery of kids who just, and I think this is rare, but some students need to know that like it's more than just the messing around part. Like that is the key starting way to kind of get the creative thing happening. But it's, those steps afterwards. Refine it, explain it to somebody else, until you're ultimately going to share it. And that's the great thing about music. Like there is an ending sort of in a way, like you're going to present this to the world and you're going to get feedback on it. You can always go back and change it, but like there's a moment in which you're going to share it. And then hopefully it's at a point where you feel confident about it and all that reflection has led you to the goal you wanted, basically. But yeah, it's all about that.
I love that you empower your students to constantly push for feedback. And you touched on collaboration a bit. You said, have their friend listen to their work and discuss their work. And in a way, it's pure feedback, right? So Dewey also emphasized, because we're fans of John Dewey here, he also emphasized the importance of social interaction and collaboration as important tenets of learning. And so I'm curious just to hear and want to hone in on that feedback piece a little bit more. How do you facilitate and how do you empower students to be a part of the social process of learning from each other and collaborating, whether it's in group projects or discussions or sharing ideas and perspectives in class?
I think one of the things about coming to Choate, I was excited about it first, and then I've had to change paths a little bit, is this idea that like the Choate student is really good at discussing, so we could, in music theory, for example, we could sit around the Harkness table and like talk about our music theory homework and insights would be gained and people would leave and have a clear understanding of what we're doing. And I kind of found out quickly that just like probably most schools, there are students who are strong at that, but there are many students who aren't, and there's different learning types who don't excel in that way. So, and then particularly with music, there's this oral element, there being sound involved. So after doing my music theory class the first year, I remember that next summer, the summer after I completed my first year, thinking about how can I make the honors music theory class more engaging for this social piece? Like how can they talk to each other more about their music in the class, like during class? So I when I was teaching middle school, I used, which many of us probably know about, Pear Deck, which is like a way in which to turn a Google slideshow into a collaborative slideshow. And the biggest sort of feature that I kind of thought about using was the idea that like I can make a slide, I can put a slide up and everybody in the class can write on the slide. So instead of students just coming in and talking about their homework, like their 4-part vocal writing homework, or me sharing each person's, what I've started to do and what I've been doing after that first year is I'll put up the assignment, and I may do this as pre-homework. I may do this the class before the assignment. So I'll put up some examples and I'll have all the kids solve them together on their own device. So Pear Deck, they're writing on their iPad with their Apple Pencil on this one slide, and they can, so they're doing it. But then after I give them a few minutes or whatever, I can then share on the projector very quickly everyone's work. It's anonymous. I'll tell students I'm going to share this, but your name is not going to be attached to it. And we're just going to talk about each one so you can see how they went about trying to solve this. And you can steal from them if they have good ideas. And I'll say, I try to make a joke out of it or lower the expectation. I'll say, if you did the worst one, first of all, we're not going to know who you are, but we're going to learn the most from the worst example because we'll be able to dissect it and talk about it. So Pear Deck has been a game changer for that sort of social piece. They're all getting a hands-on experience by doing the actual work, but then we can have a conversation about everybody's work very quickly. The back end allows me to see whose work is being submitted. So if there is a kid, and I can kind of tell even just by walking around, I can see very quickly and have a record of this student is always struggling or has been struggling the last 2 weeks with this, so I can make sure I give that kid special attention. So that social thing, the last thing I'll say about it, what I love about it is it because it's anonymous, it lowers the stakes for the kids. Everybody's trying hard. They're putting their work up there. The student that feels like this is something they're good at, it's validated. I'm seeing it. Everybody's seeing it. The student who needs help, they're sharing it in a safe way. So we're kind of seeing it. Beyond the classroom, so beyond the actual classroom, big fan of Hypothesis. I use that for the readings. Yeah. I'll say to kids, we had and our last class of music theory this year, I said to them, I was like, what do you think of those Hypothesis example or assignments? Because my sense is some of you really get into it and answer a lot of other, your peers' comments, and some of you I can tell are kind of just going through the motions a little bit. But the discussion was good. They were honest, and it seemed like it was maybe like a 70-30. Like most of the kids found it useful, and they could, get a question quickly answered. And there were some who were like, I just went in there and I just kind of did the assignment that you asked me to make a comment. And even though I knew everything, I just kind of made a comment. So that's important to look at. But that is another piece in which they're having a conversation. They're being social about it, and it doesn't take the actual class time to have some of those conversations, which I like.
One quick note on that I found really interesting to observe is that if you have something like Hypothesis, precisely because that particular form is not going to resonate with everyone, having another mode of expression for outside of the classroom community building where they have the option to use both has been very powerful. So typically we have everybody in Moral Reasoning and Spiritual Journeys, they'll read and annotate every assignment with Hypothesis and also record a flip video reacting to it at the end. And some kids really dive into the flip and don't do a ton of annotating. Some kids do a ton of annotating and struggle to even produce a flip because they're camera shy or whatever. And they're allowed to, we have check-in points at midterm and end of term where they're self-evaluating and reflecting, and they can advocate and say, hey, I know I didn't really do a lot in the Hypothesis because I find that I get bogged down if I'm overly annotating and I want to get in the flow, and then I let it all out in the flip response. So people listening out there, note that can be an important.
The other thing I would say just also about the social piece, I do find it that it's important to say, usually at some point in the class, okay, we're going to close our iPads or let's close our laptops, So it's usually at the beginning we may actually try to do this, but to have a connection, just whether it be a conversation or some activity that often isn't even part of the subject matter, just to make sure that we're building community and doing that without devices, I think is pretty important.
It speaks to we have an ongoing thread talking about the iPad program, quote unquote, and technology in the classroom, in the Choate classroom, quote unquote. And the things that you're speaking to very much align with our academic tech philosophy here, where it's not about jamming more and more technology in the classroom per se. It's about wisely using technology throughout the whole educational experience and broadening your view of technology to not just be just digital, but it's
Yeah, well, this
Go ahead.
brings the thing I wanted to mention is the idea that was popular, I don't know, 10 years ago maybe or less a little bit, is the idea of a flipped classroom and how technology made that a reality in the sense that like certain things could happen before class so that when you are in class, you can just have discussion more, you can talk more, you can not have to use the technology. And so I'm always thinking about that, you know, as like, can the technology free up time that we're together to do something else?
Yes. It's the most
Yeah.
sacred time that you
Yeah.
have together.
Yeah.
Like you're only together as humans in this time and space for 3 days a week. How are we going to tap
Yeah.
into our deepest potential?
Whatever
as humans
happened to
here?
that saying of flipped classroom? It just seems to have vanished. Or am I just out of the loop now?
No, it's still.
It's still
I mean,
around.
It's
All
still
right, good.
around. Kids are not used to it.
Yeah.
I've
Maybe
had
it's
students complaining.
become more normalized, so it's not such a hot button topic. You
right.
know, it's like, oh yeah, this is something we do.
I mean, I do think that it's something that we need to continue to push for.
Yeah.
Because as we've just discussed, it frees up space for students to interact, to collaborate, and to build those 21st century deeper learning skills. So we're not just focused on content or factual regurgitation,
Yeah.
but more so on like you
Yeah,
said,
the
creativity,
process, yeah.
critical thinking,
Yeah.
collaboration,
Yeah.
citizenship,
Yeah.
right? All those pieces that need to be in place for them to be successful in any realm of life and not just for your subject.
Yeah.
And so how do we do that, right? So I do think that in a way we have to be strategic, or at least continue the conversation of how to do flip classrooms
Yeah.
in our own content and disciplines.
Sure. That's one of the things that maybe one of the many negative things about the pandemic is there's such a push now to be back in the classroom, of course. And we got really good at the technology during the pandemic. Like, I don't want us to lose those techniques because they will help the flipped classroom. You know, I think if we keep the balance.
Yeah.
That's my thought.
Definitely a lot of things that emerged by necessity in the pandemic that I think a decent amount of us have realized, oh, well, this is something that is a universally great thing for any classroom. So we're going to keep utilizing certain things in the whatever. This isn't even, what do we call this era?
I know.
It's not post-pandemic. No.
I don't know. we'll find out what it's going to be called after 5 years
The
from
history
now.
books.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a question that is something that I've been grappling with, and there's a philosophy on education that I've tried to live and breathe in my classroom every single day. And it's another favorite educational philosopher of mine, Christopher Edman, who did a lot of work on reality pedagogy. And he said that true teaching is only effective when it triggers something that lasts forever and sparks a desire for the student to continue to explore it more deeply on their own or to discover more on their own. And so I try to live by this. And so based on this conversation, hearing from you and just being inspired by your educational background and your musical background, I'm curious to hear more about how you design learning experiences in a way that sparks your class or your students to continue to explore it deeply on their own outside of the classroom.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it starts with knowing the students first. So in other words, if I'm coming at it with they're already sort of having thoughts about their interests, what they want to be doing, yes, I want to obviously broaden their scope and turn them onto new things. But if I'm doing it in a way that is starting from where they're at already, then there's a greater likelihood that they're going to continue doing it afterwards, you know, because it's maybe more consistent with what they have already been doing. And that happens. It's probably easier for me to do something like that in a music production class and harder to do something like that in like the honors music theory class. And to some degree, it's, you know, so it's easier to do that in like jazz ensemble and harder to do that in wind ensemble, just by the nature of the average student and what they've been exposed to. But when I'm sort of designing an assignment in music production, it's easy to think about, well, okay, I could choose any style for talking about how to make beats or something. But why not have them suggest 5 artists of beats that they like and they want to know how to make those kinds of beats? I can certainly learn about those artists and how those beats are made, and then we can dissect those. It doesn't have to come from me. It can come from them. So that's kind of an easy, low-hanging fruit for something like that. It's harder when it's honors music theory, and I have to, you know, we have to explore like the rules of Western music theory, that they're not going to point to an artist and say like, oh, I really love the way Taylor Swift has voice leading her songs or something. So it's harder for me to. And the other thing is too is students are very diverse in their interests. So I have to do my due diligence, and I'll always start every year. And I usually like refresh. If it's a year-long course like music theory, I'll do a refresher at the beginning of the term to have them share like, what are you listening to? What artists have you been into lately? Why? So I'm always trying to mine their interests for how I'm going to create a curriculum topic or an activity or an assignment to dive into a concept. So really, that's my answer. It really has to start with them. The other thing is the degree to which I can demonstrate or be myself in terms of just like when it comes to music anyway, to make them see, hopefully, that I still love making music and I love listening to music, and it's something that I do, not because I'm a teacher or because I'm in the classroom. Then my hope is that they'll see like, oh yeah, this is something that I might also enjoy doing beyond just being in a classroom. Yeah. The weird thing about the arts is, particularly music, it's not a requirement, like certain students or every student is sort of trained. You have to take math and English and the sciences, and it's sort of like built into them. Like I have to do these things. So I'm always thinking about the motivational piece when it comes to music education. It's like, do they know why they're doing this? Are they able to ask themselves or answer that question for themselves? Why am I doing this? So I'm always kind of trying to think of that.
Yeah, and that certainly cuts across the whole realm. The whole philosophy behind motivation in education is the idea that students can identify themselves in the curriculum, or they can see themselves in the curriculum. There's an identity aspect to deeper learning. And now we're like integrating this piece of motivation right into it. So in order for them to be motivated, they have to be able to see themselves in this curriculum. They have to be interested. Yeah. So your instruction should be catered to their interests and needs. Yeah. And that enhances the entire learning experience and helps them become more creative if they can factor their own identity into it. Yep. There's a book that was published like 3 years ago. It's by Zhao Mehta, the Harvard professor who wrote a book called In Search of Deeper Learning. And in it, he discusses what is deeper learning. And this is a long-term study that he did with one of his coworkers at Harvard, looking at different schools across the nation, looking at their best practices and trying to identify the magical formula for what makes learning stick. And they've identified a couple factors. They said, of course, mastery, creativity, which we've been discussing, and also that identity piece. Yeah. Can they see themselves in the curriculum?
Yeah, that makes total sense. For me, I always think of it as like achieving the flow state. Yes. And that may or may not lead to it continuing on, but like that was always something that I could see in myself. So like I know like when I'm the rare occasions when I, get into that zone and time just seems to disappear and becomes a different way to measure time, then I'm super motivated afterwards. And I feel like, oh yeah, this is why I was doing this. It was so fun. That was so rewarding. And like if a student can kind of experience that, I feel like that is going to generate so much motivation. So, it's hard. It's hard, but that's sort of one of the pillars for me in terms of trying to make sort of the structure for that to happen. Yeah. A great book that I read, this is going way back graduate school, Stephen Nachmanovich, maybe people know this, called Free Play. And it's about music, but it's just about art and creativity in general, but it's the idea that we are most creative when we're children, and if you watch a child play, they're in the flow state all the time. Yep. So it's trying to figure out ways to have design experiences that allow learners to get back to that. Eventually.
Yeah. Another book rec. Have you read Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
Which you may recall.
I'm glad you didn't try to say his last name because
I think it's Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. I think that's what he said. I had a professor in college who spelled it out for me. I was like, okay, that's what you said. But regarding identity, I mean, that's a critical universal aspect of the flow state thing. Is that there's this paradoxical thing going on with identity where simultaneously in that moment of flow state, you are completely dropping all of the ego-minded narratives about who you are because there's no room for that.
You're just in it. You'll crash.
But at the same time, you're directly in touch with a much more deep and profound sense of identity.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, when we can set up situations for people to naturally experience that, it has not only is going to make them more motivated to do your particular subject, but they're going to feel more connected and whole as people. And going back to what you said a minute ago, I mean, that does seem to be the key for cultivating motivation in students is first and foremost, as you said, helping them know that they are seen as whole people first.
Yeah.
And then they are there for learners in your specific subject. And this came up in Reflective Educators a couple months ago, where we have a really unique opportunity in the boarding school environment to help our students be seen in these other areas of life. Jessica just brought up that, one afternoon I had gone over to see a student in ArtsCon who was in my moral reasoning class at the time. And I just walked around for a little bit, saw what he was working on.
Yeah.
And it was serendipitous because it was when we were trying to get together as a faculty group to play music somewhere, but the jam room and all the rooms were taken up. So I was like, let's walk over to ArtsCon. And Jessica mentioned that the students were talking about that. They're like, it was so awesome that people came over and saw what we were doing.
Yeah.
And so us as teachers in our individual disciplines, the more that we can go and see our students on the sports field at ArtsCon or whatever, it can of course be tough, especially with people with kids of our own, to squeeze these things in. But when you can find the time and place to do it, it makes a huge impact on the effort that the students are going to be bringing into your classes.
100%. Yeah.
It's totally worth the investment of time.
Yeah.
And it can be hard to do, even though it's possible.
I know.
We're, of course, all running around like chickens with our heads cut off. So just make a little plug for that.
No, it's great.
And I think that kind of naturally leads into also this big question that I know you mentioned before we started the official interview, contemplating this question of in what ways does technology humanize us, and in which ways does it dehumanize us?
Yeah, that's a tough one. The ways in which it humanizes us, I sort of the first thing I came to in thinking about that was that if it allows us to see ourselves in other people, and that kind of comes from the connection piece. Certainly I feel more connected to people halfway around the world, and more so now if I'm able to kind of get a greater sense of their experience. But that's still hard for me, that one. It's very easy for it to feel dehumanizing. I think with music, I think there were some other pre-questions, and one of them that I liked was the ways in which I try to deconnect from technology. And I thought of the way I do that is like I play music, and I do that without technology. Like I'll play the saxophone,
right?
And I still do that every day, and that. I suppose the saxophone is a form of technology for sure, but like it's something that I purposely do without a screen, without being plugged in even or anything like that. And that is a danger when I'm trying to then make music with technology. Because when I'm playing the saxophone, I've gotten to a point where it doesn't feel like it's a piece of technology. It's an extension of myself. So I'm very much like singing, and that is why I'm able to find it an escape from technology. But if I go to the studio and I start working on a song or something, or I'm dealing with drum machines and computers, stuff like that, then the technology starts to get in the way, and I feel dehumanized. Like I'm not just dealing with my own human capabilities. And we've talked a lot about how great the technology can be. We spend a lot of time talking about that. So there is that balance, and I try to remind myself of that when it comes to my own music making and technology, because if I'm bringing this into my students' curriculum, I have to be aware that they're going to have that same experience. What I have students in music production get just super frustrated that some app keeps crashing, or like the microphone is plugged in but it's not working. All these things. So yeah, it can really remove yourself from yourself often if it's not flowing, if it's not working. So that's something for me to keep an eye on all the time.
And how do you keep an eye on that with your own children?
Ooh,
as fellow parents of people who were, in these crucial years during the pandemic, and we had to lean on it. But Yeah.
We all must be kind to ourselves as parents. And it's okay if we're not. It's so easy to see like some meme about like some perfect parenting tip about how to do that or whatever. Like when it comes down to it, you just got to do your best. Anyway, so I try to cut myself some slack. And we don't really have any rules. Like I feel like we try to do, and we do a fairly good job of just keeping track of the screen time, and limiting that in a healthy way without like having consequences or rewards or something like that, but just planning enough other activities, It's like, we're going to go outside for a walk. We haven't been outside or whatever it is, like trying to do things that are going to seem more engaging than watching something. That's one. And the other big one I will say, and this is the one that I talk about with my wife all the time is, and this is harder, is to try and ensure that I am not looking at a screen. It's so easy, and I do it without knowing, like to really be conscious of like, I don't need to look at my phone right now. The kids are around, I'm going to put it away. And I'm thinking about how much that's going to influence their desire to have one of these devices pretty soon. Stuff like that.
That's great to hear. Let's end on the question that we make sure everyone answers here, and we could not let you go without answering this.
Okay.
For some recommendations for music that fellow faculty can put on when they're either in end of the year grading, comment writing mode, or whatever context that you found different music appropriate for. Have at it.
First of all, I'm not someone who can listen to music while I'm grading. Just saying. Music tends to be listening to music tends to be an engaging activity, active listening. So that's the one thing. But I've been listening a lot to, and I don't know how many. Maybe everybody knows about this. Is a Wolfpack. I'm sure, like, it's just fun, and classic sounding while it is relatively not that old. That's been my go-to lately over the last week or so, and I've just thought like it just makes me feel possibility. Like it sounds old school, but it's super not in a way. So Wolfpack is a good recommendation. Check it out, people.
Nice.
You have not listened to any Wolfpack.
And your capstone advisee, Zoe, fellow
huge
she's
big
Wolfpack fan.
Yeah, the kids are into it. Yeah, kids are very much into it. I try to, as much as I can, like, and this isn't an example of that. I just happened upon Wolfpack and I was like, oh, this is great. But I do find myself forcing myself to listen to certain music that I maybe wouldn't based on what students' interests are. But Wolfpack is not one of those. I highly recommend it for everybody. Check it out.
I second that.
Cool.
Awesome. Are there any closing things that you have been on your mind that we didn't get to touch to that you want to put out there?
I think we covered a lot of good things. These are good questions. I guess the big thing is like anytime I talk to somebody about this, I don't want people to think that technology is any different than good teaching. I feel like good teaching, I can say this fairly confidently now, without too many people pushing back. I feel like good teaching uses technology. I think there was a time not that long ago, 5-10 years ago, where you could say like, no, there's good teaching and it doesn't need technology because there's teachers who've been doing it for a long time, and there's ways in which the technology isn't necessary and it's still great teaching. I kind of feel like just the way things have moved and where our students are at, that good teaching needs to include technology. I don't know if that's controversial. Maybe it's not controversial. I hope it's not.
Not in this room.
Okay, right. But just to the average, teacher has been doing it a long time. That would be a great question to go around with a bunch of experienced teachers, because I do ask myself that. I'm like, could I do everything I'm doing without technology and have it still be a great experience? I kind of think that I could, but now I don't know. I think there are ways in which that it's moved to such a point, like some of those tools are essential. Leave it at that.
All right. I love it.
Okay.
Of course, we could spend hours more talking about all this stuff, but Matthew, thank you so much for spending the time with us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.